Hello and welcome to Critical Reading with Purpose and Focus. Today we're going to talk about how to read in depth, how to read between the lines, and how to tackle all of those challenging articles that you might be experiencing with your reading in this course. So, as I do with every lesson starts with just a quick overview of what we're going to cover, just so you're prepared. So we're going to talk about the difference between mindless reading and critical reading. Mindless reading is probably what you're used to, maybe not, but most students entering college are more used to kind of skimming and scanning and things like that. So we're going to break that down. We're going to talk about how to read critically. I'm going to give you very specific strategies for reading critically. We're going to talk about how to annotate. If you haven't done that before, I'll give you, again, specific strategies that you can take with you from this lesson, and then how to take notes on your reading. So I have specific questions for you. You can pause the PowerPoint, you can download this presentation and take a screenshot or write it down as we're going, as you're pausing it. So how do you read now? So I want you to just think about this. Again, you can pause the video after I'm done reading through this slide and talking through this slide, but I want you to just think about what you do when you're reading. Are you focused? Most people are not, myself included. I have to really kind of buckle down if I'm going to read something, especially something that I might not be particularly interested in that I have to read, or something that's very lengthy or out of my wheelhouse. So thinking about what else you're doing while you're reading. Are you watching TV, or is the TV on? Do you have music on? Are you on your phone on social media? Are you rushing through a reading just to get done? Usually all of us are doing one or more of these things. And then after that, just think about how much you remember of what you read. And again, I know I'm guilty of this, which is where annotating is going to come in. But think about, do you remember what you read yesterday? So if you read something on social media, or you read something for school, or you were even just reading a book that you liked, what do you remember about that? Do you remember what you read last week? How about last year? And again, when we're not reading critically, we might not remember what we're reading from day to day, or what we read last year. We really want to work on building our reading, not just reading something just to get through it. So most students, again, when they enter college, are not reading critically just because they were never taught to. I don't ever remember until my senior year of high school, and I was going to college to be an English major. My senior year of high school, I was taught how to annotate and how to read critically. And I always liked reading, and I was always, very good at reading comprehension, but nobody ever taught me how to take notes when I was reading. Nobody taught me how to annotate. Nobody taught me how to remember anything about what I was reading. I just happened to like reading and have a good memory, but that's not always the case for everybody. So that's what we're going to talk about today, is how to overcome mindless reading. Now, just because I say this is what mindless reading is and don't do X, Y, and Z doesn't mean that tomorrow you're going to be cured of mindless reading. This is a practice. This is something that's going to take a while for you to adjust to and be able to do without thinking so much. So just keep that in mind, that as you are listening to this is something you have to practice and that you will get better at over time. It's just going to take some time. So mindless reading, again, I always like to talk about this before I get into critical reading. Mindless reading is reading without retaining or even comprehending what you read. When we scroll through social media, that's mindless reading. When we're reading through the news, that's usually mindless reading. We're just reading through it just to get an idea of what's going on. We're not really reading to dissect it. And once you start reading to dissect, then you'll start doing it automatically. And that's what I do because I've done so much critical reading over the years in both my bachelor's and my master's degree, and now in my doctorate degree. I have to read critically, or I'm not going to be able to write about what I'm reading. So start to think about, do you skim through things? Do you scan and look for specific information? Are you rushing through a reading? I know I'm guilty of that even still today. If I'm reading something I'm not interested in, I'm rushing through it. Are you reading when you're distracted? Are there things going on around you that are keeping you from focusing totally on what's going on in whatever it is that you're reading? But I want you to remember, all of these things, they have their purpose, but not in academic reading. They're ineffective. you're essentially wasting your time by scanning through something that you're not going to remember tomorrow or next week or for the exam or whatever the case might be. So again, you're wasting your time. It's better to invest a little bit more time and read critically and have notes and remember what you read and start to make connections between the things you're reading than to just say, okay, I rushed through this. I didn't really understand it, but I read it, so I can say that I read it. And that's a lot of times what happens when students come to college and they feel very overwhelmed with all of the reading that they have to do. It's probably a lot more than you had to do in high school, or even if, this is English 151, so this is probably your first college level English class. You might have taken English 091 or 095, but that's very different than this course. You're going to be doing a lot of reading over the next 5 weeks. So just keep that in mind. So critical reading is the opposite of mindless reading. It's an active process. It's not just reading. It involves annotating. It involves questioning what you're reading, thinking about what you're reading, and not just taking it at face value. That's one of the biggest mistakes that people make, and that's why things like fake news, which we talked about in the last lecture, spread so quickly, because people don't think about what they're reading. They just read something, and then it sounds good, and then they share it on the interwebs, and then everybody thinks that this is true. And we have to start thinking about what we're reading. We have to make connections. If you read something that contradicts something else you read, well, why is it contradicting? What evidence does this person present that contradicts evidence that the other person presented? It doesn't mean someone's right or wrong, but you want to start making connections between the things that you're reading. That's critical reading in a nutshell. What I'm going to do, instead of just give you a philosophical lecture on critical reading, I'm actually going to give you the strategies to break down your reading process so that you realize it's not just picking up an article and skimming through it and saying you read it. There's a lot more involved, and that's what the next few slides are going to talk about. So the first thing you want to do before you even read the first sentence or page 1 is do a little bit of what I call pre-reading. So this is looking at who the author is. What do you know about that author? What might you want or need to know about that author? So for example, if you're reading a short story by Edgar Allan Poe, well, what do you already know about Edgar Allan Poe? When did he live? What was he famous for? When was he publishing? Where was he publishing? Who was publishing his work? So thinking about things like that. If you're reading an article by a scholar, you may not know anything about that author. So you need to do a little bit of research. Sometimes the article will tell you in a little blurb who the author is and where they work and what they do. But sometimes you have to take that initiative yourself. You have to go into the Google and see what this person's doing. So making sure you do a little bit of background research or investigation into who the author is. Why is that important, right? We want to know what they're writing, why they're writing it, what other things they've written about this. We want people who are experts, right? We don't want just someone who's a run-of-the-mill journalist writing about something that's really important, right? That's good for everyday awareness, but it's not good for academic research. So what is this person's credentials? We also want to look at where something was published. Nowadays, it's not always as important because everything's published online for the most part. Not as many things are published by publishers like Penguin or something like that. But a lot of academic pieces are going to be published by a university. Which university published it? Where is that university? What might the perspective be there? Think about what's significant about the place that this was published. If it's online, right? So thinking about the website where something was published. We know some websites are not as reputable as others, and I have students argue with me about Wikipedia all the time. Wikipedia has gotten better over the years, but it's still, anybody can go in and write something in Wikipedia. So just be very careful with websites like that. When you're thinking about a book and it's where it was physically, the location where it was published, the example I always like to give is think about the American Revolutionary War, right? We have a textbook on the Revolutionary War that was published in, let's say, Boston, and then we have another textbook that was published in London. Those two places and those two contexts are going to tell that story very differently. Neither one is right or wrong, they're just different perspectives. We want to remember that as well. The other example I give is the Civil War, right? We have two textbooks about the Civil War, one published in New York, one published in Alabama, right? They're going to be very different sides of that story. So just keep that in mind as well, because that's important. If you're reading something like an essay or an article, you want to look and see if you can find what the author's thesis is. We're going to talk about thesis statements in the next couple of lessons. But what's their argument? You want to see if you can kind of skim the first couple of paragraphs and see if you can figure out, well, what's their stance on this? What's their argument? What's their reasoning for it? And that's going to help you understand the purpose of the article by looking for that first. You also want to think about what you already know about the topic. So if you're reading about hydraulic fracking, just off the top of my head, I just saw something about that, so that's sticking out. What do you know about that already? And kind of just jot that down in your notes, either in the margins of the article, in a notebook, however you choose to annotate, which we'll talk about in a minute. But think about what you already know about it. And then if you don't know a lot about it, what do you hope to learn from it? Even if you do know a lot about it, what do you want to learn from that piece based on the title and the abstract or what you have read of it so far? Then think about why you're reading this. Besides, if it's something assigned, like, okay, I'm forced to read it. Okay, why are you forced to read it, right? Why would your professor assign this particular reading? Or if you picked it yourself, why am I reading this? Is it for a project? Is it for pleasure? And then that'll help you determine your purpose for why you're reading it. And that will help you pinpoint exactly what you need to annotate for. So answering all these questions, it took me a few minutes just to go over those pre-reading questions. So take a few minutes before you dive into something and see who the author is, see where it was published. Gather that information and then start reading. You want to start taking notes. You want to keep notes. As you get better at this, you can keep less notes. I still keep lots of notes. I like to annotate in the margins of things. I don't really like to have separate pieces of paper, but when I first started out in graduate school, the second time when I was working on my doctorate, I started just keeping actual physical written reflections of all the things I was reading because I was exposed to things that I hadn't read before. So I started just writing down a paragraph about what my feelings were about that article or what I thought about it or what my reactions were to that. So just start getting in the practice of writing these things down. It doesn't have to be complete sentences. It can just be bullet points. It's for you. I'm not going to collect your annotations. That's up to you and your notes. Okay, so annotating. This is one of my favorite things to talk about. It's one of my favorite things to do. I geek out about it. I annotate readings that I do for fun. Not as much as I used to, but I still do. If I like a quote or something makes me think, I'll put a little sticky note in a novel. Once you finish your pre-reading, then you want to start reading, but you don't, again, just want to skim through it. Keep a pen, highlighter, notebook, Post-its, however you want to annotate handy to take notes. It's going to slow down your reading process, and it's going to do that on purpose. You don't want to rush through it. The longer you take on a reading, the more you will get out of it. So some things that you want to annotate for, a lot of people say, well, what do I annotate? What am I looking for? The first thing I look for is any new vocabulary. Students that are just starting out with this type of reading often will just skip over words they don't know. We don't want to do that. We want to look up words that we don't know. And you can either write down those definitions in the margins or on Post-its or in a notebook. I remember when I took Shakespeare in college, there was a lot of words I just didn't know because I wasn't familiar with the language. And I had so many Post-it notes of words that I had looked up, but I learned all these new words too. So with each Shakespeare play I read, I looked up less things because I was learning the vocabulary. And then you can see at the end of the semester or the class or the reading how many new words you learned. You also want to annotate any important quotes or phrases. You don't just want to highlight them though. That's like a habit we can get into, a bad habit we can get into where we just start highlighting everything. I say highlight quotes that you think you might want to put in your paper and write down why. So either, again, stick a Post-it note or make a note in the margin or in your notebook with a page number, why you highlighted it. And again, as you get better at this, you don't have to do that as much. But I know even myself, if I highlight something, sometimes I don't make a note. And I'm like, why did I highlight this? Why is this important? And that'll teach you to highlight only the really important things. So that's the next thing you want to annotate. The next thing is questions. You always want to ask questions while you're reading. Even if you're just writing like, why is this happening? Why are they saying this? Where did they get this information? Why do I agree or disagree with this? Just start asking questions. If something doesn't seem right, ask a question. If you want to know more, ask a question. I do that all the time. Sometimes I'll even write just like WTF in the margin. Like, what are they talking about? I don't understand what's happening here when they say something. Or I'm known to say, just write like, really, with a question mark next to it. Like, this is really what the conclusion that you came to. It doesn't have to be so serious. Have a little bit of fun with it. Next thing to annotate, summarizing and paraphrasing as you go. Paraphrasing, not so much unless there's something that you're really not understanding or comprehending. Paraphrasing can help with that. I'll talk about the difference between these two a little bit more in depth on the next slide. Summarizing is just kind of giving a brief overview of something. So when I was in college for my Shakespeare class, I took this professor a few other times, we had to find 3 articles for a research paper, and we had to summarize every single paragraph in the margin into one sentence. And I hated doing it. I hated doing it every single semester for like 4 semesters in a row. But when I went to go write the paper, I had all my thoughts and I had all my summaries done. The paper wrote itself. So just keep that in mind, that if, you kind of create your own spark notes along the way if you do that. So you don't have to keep rereading the article. And then any comments, connections, predictions. Again, there's no wrong way to annotate as long as you're writing something and you're connecting with that text. Annotating is a kinesthetic process. You're actually having physical contact with what it is that you're reading. And I think that's the most important part when you're learning how to do this, is that you're actually connecting physically with whatever it is you're reading. You can annotate online on a computer, on a PDF, but I prefer the good old-fashioned print it out if you can. I know these are challenging times and not everyone has access to a printer, but printing it out and writing it down. And if you are reading it on the computer, at least write handwritten notes while you're reading it. All right, next slide is, again, we want to work on putting things in our own words. So 1, that we don't plagiarize by accident, and 2, just to learn how to explain what other people said in our own words. So summarizing and paraphrasing, these words often get used interchangeably, but they're very different techniques. So summarizing is standing back and just briefly stating the whole picture of what's going on. You're condensing the text. So if you read a 3-page article, to summarize that, you really don't want to write more than 3 paragraphs, if not less than that. If you've ever read an abstract on an article, that's a summary. If you've ever used Spark Notes, you don't need to divulge yourself if you have, but if you've ever used Spark Notes, those are summaries of text, right? Why do you read Spark Notes or Cliff Notes or Schmoop or whatever it is? It's because you didn't understand, hopefully this is why you're reading it, because you didn't understand what you read and you need someone to summarize it for you so you get an idea. I remember when I was in high school, we were reading Great Expectations, and it was so boring. I do not like Charles Dickens, but some people think he's great. But I was struggling, and I found the Spark Notes, and I was the only person in class who knew what was going on, because I would read the chapter from Charles Dickens, who got paid by the word, so all kinds of extra words didn't need to be there, and then I would read the Spark Notes for that chapter after. And then I would say, okay, now I understand what's going on, and I have this chapter. I read the whole thing, so reading the chapter and reading a summary. Paraphrasing, on the other hand, is rewording a text, or as I like to say, translating the author's language into your own. So this is good if you're writing a paper. I remember I had a class in my doctorate program where the whole class, we were not allowed to quote. We had to paraphrase everything so that we learned not to rely on quotes. We had to really work it into our own thoughts. We still had to cite it because it wasn't my ideas or wasn't my ideas, but I had to learn how to paraphrase. And now I probably paraphrase more than I quote when I'm writing, and that's just more of an APA thing. Whereas in English, we quoted more because we were quoting directly from novels where you don't want to just paraphrase it, right? Because you're analyzing it. So paraphrasing is as long as the original. Sometimes it's longer depending on how complex the idea is. But paraphrasing doesn't leave out details, whereas summarizing does. Summarizing is just looking for the main ideas. Okay, so our last not last slide, I have one more slide after this, but our last kind of lesson here for today is post-reading or afterthoughts. So you've done the pre-reading, you've done your annotating, you summarized it after you were done, or you paraphrased some parts that you think were important. Now you want to post-read or have some afterthoughts. So when you're in class, right, so in an English class, maybe in high school, you would go home and read and then come to class and discuss. Because the reading doesn't end when the essay does, or when the short story or the poem or whatever. You have to reflect on what you just read and prepare for whatever discussion or the next step or the paper. So write down questions that you have. And it could be, I didn't understand what the author meant by fill in the blank. If the reading is for a discussion, bring the questions to class. And there's this misnomer that teachers and professors don't like when students ask questions about a reading. I love when students ask questions about a reading because that means you read it and you thought about it and you have thoughts about it, that you want to know more. So don't ever be afraid to ask questions about anything, but especially about reading. Ask yourself if the author proved their thesis. So if you're reading an essay or article and you come to the end, ask yourself, did their argument conclude? Did they prove what they said they wanted to prove in their thesis or in their introduction? You want to review that new vocabulary that you have. Again, like I said, keep a running list, and then you can see how many new words you learn every semester with every reading. The best way to learn new vocabulary is in context. So for example, I'm learning, trying to teach myself Italian using Babbel as the app. So one of their hints or kind of, tips for success was, pick some words that you just learned and then go Google search those and see what articles come up where those words are used in context, because then you'll see them being used. Students always come to my class and say, I say, what are your goals this semester? And they say, I want to improve my vocabulary or expand my vocabulary. How do I do that? And when I tell them they have to read more things that are outside of their comfort zone, they look at me like, I just told them they have to go shoot themselves to the moon. And that's not how it works. Like, I can't just pour vocabulary words into your head. You have to go out and learn them. And this is the best way to do that. Also, remember, sometimes you might have to read something more than once, especially if it's something like a journal article that you're not used to reading. I know I have to do this. I have to read things 2 and 3 times sometimes to really get what's going on and grasp the ideas. Again, very true for academic articles. It's still true for me. I still have to read things multiple times, but if you annotate really well and you summarize really well as you're going, it's going to make it a lot easier for you to keep reviewing it. And then prepare for discussion. So again, most of the time, maybe not in our remote situation now, but most of the time in college when you have to read something, you're reading it because you're going to discuss it in the next class. So compile your comments, have something to contribute that is original, whether it's a question or a comment or a connection to something else, or even just a personal reflection on it. Have something to contribute that's meaningful, either in group discussion or class discussion. Okay, so as usual, I have a little debriefing at the end of our lesson. So we did cover mindless and critical reading, annotating, post and pre-reading, summarizing, paraphrasing. I gave you a lot of information, as I always do. And it's hard because we're not sitting in class, so we're not taking breaks for questions or doing group discussion. So I know you get a lot of information in, 25 minutes? But take your time when reading. If you learn nothing else from this lesson, take your time. Rushing through your homework is going to make more work for you later because you're not going to remember what you read that day. So reading is important. Obviously, I know you know how to read. You didn't get this far in life not knowing how to read. But you probably were not taught how to annotate and how to read critically, and that's okay. I wasn't taught, like I said, until my senior year of high school, and that was just the annotating part. I didn't learn about the pre-reading or the post-reading. These are things that I just picked up along the way, and that I'm passing along to you and saving you all the frustration that I experienced as a student. So make sure you check your homework. Make sure you attend our next class. As I said earlier, this is a flipped class model, so you're watching the lectures on your own, and then we're coming to class to talk about it. So we're going to talk about critical reading. I'm going to answer your questions about critical reading and about critical thinking. We're going to talk about conspiracies and how, conspiracy theories spread from lack of critical thinking and lack of critical reading. But I want you to have this and take notes. The PowerPoints, again, you can download these videos or watch them on YouTube, save the links, whatever you want to do. But I want you to have this information. So have a great rest of your day. I hope you learned something. Feel free to rewatch this as many times as you need to, and I will see you in class.